The Alien IP has always been somewhat infamous for, shall we say, producing games of a certain less than desirable, often nebulous nature. While there are a meager handful of games, like 2010's Alien vs. Predator and the beloved cult classic Alien Isolation, that seemingly won over pretty much every gaming content creator on the planet, these few great entries have been tragically outnumbered by the mostly manure-level quality PC, console, handheld, and mobile titles that were all thoughtlessly shoved out to earn a quick buck off people's nostalgia for the series. Probably the best or rather worst example of this that, of course, comes to mind is Aliens Colonial Marines, a game so horrifically bad made worse by the publisher, Gearbox, flagrantly spreading false pre-rendered gameplay and false promises in order to cover up the abomination of a game they had thrown together, that it ultimately became one of the most infamous AAA gaming disasters of all time. It's interesting then that 8 years later, here we are with a new Colonial Marines game from a completely untested development studio with no prior releases, with the game being published by Focus Home Interactive, a publisher that has made quite a name for itself over the past few years by basically becoming the go-to publisher for relatively high-quality AA mid-budget games. So naturally I've been keeping my eye on this bizarre convergence, and thought about buying the game at launch, but after seeing some initial gameplay and reading a few reviews online, I just opted out of buying it, figuring it would eventually go either free-to-play or attach itself to a subscription service of some kind. Sure enough, a few months later, here we are with the game being officially added to the Xbox Game Pass for both Xbox and PC. So with that preamble out of the way, let's answer the title question of whether Alien Fireteam Elite is worth your money, whether via purchase on Steam or via your paid Xbox Game Pass subscription. Let's start by discussing the central hub you'll be starting off in and spending the entirety of your spare time in between missions. You have this big hangar with a few offshoots where you can interact with a variety of NPCs. That said, unless you're a diehard Alien Universe lore nerd, you probably won't bother ever doing so unless you have to, because they don't really provide any gameplay value. They're almost exclusively used as a depository and dispenser of in-game lore, which in theory would be rather interesting, but the way they communicate it with you on screen feels so lifeless and static that you'll never actually bother to do so. Honestly, try to tell me with a straight face that this is in any way appealing as an interaction interface. The lack of any expressive facial or bodily animations in regards to these NPCs kills any prospect of this centralized hub being even remotely atmospheric. Personally, I'm not looking for elaborately detailed cutscenes every time you go to interact with a hub-based NPC, but I don't think it'd be too much to ask that we at least get something similar to, say, how Civilization 6 handles NPC interactions, where it's all motion captured with a variety of facial expressions and physical movements or behaviors that are unique to each character. With the relatively easy access to basic motion capture technology, even smaller or medium-sized AA studios can afford to spend at least a few days or weeks capturing the necessary material without significantly holding up the overall production, especially since doing so would save some time compared to animating everything from scratch manually. And odds are that still wouldn't look as genuine as motion capture does. We're talking about maybe a dozen or so relatively insignificant NPCs that would need a meager handful of animations compared to the dozens of hours of motion capture that a AAA game like most of PlayStation's recent lineup would normally require. It's not that much to ask in the grand scheme of things. Speaking of immersion-related things, let's talk about character customization, because surprisingly that's actually a thing here, albeit mostly in name only. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. The character customization interface is somehow one of the worst I've ever seen in recent years from any AAA or AA produced game, and that includes New World, which certainly had very little to brag about. But at least one saving grace I can and will attribute towards New World was that at least their character customization interface made it very easy for you to make the ugliest and stupidest looking character possible, with the only exception being that they still had to look somewhat like human beings, albeit poorly rendered ones. Here, the lack of a proper color wheel for hair and skin, the lack of variety in voice options, the complete inability to add custom tattoos, scars, or other distinctive markings to your character, the inability to make specific adjustments to your character's physical traits like ear type, nose type, hair, height and weight adjustments, etc., all is to the game's detriment. While one could argue theoretically that maybe some of this is due to the developers wanting to ensure players wouldn't create a character that looks more horrifying than the xenomorphs they're trying to fight, I would argue at the end of the day, who gives a shit? If I want to cosplay as a deformed, unrealistically shaped, oddly but vividly scarred and tattooed abomination that, despite being marked as a male, has a voice that sounds like a high-pitched speaking Barbie doll, inconceivably but hilariously stupid as that may be, the game should at least allow me some leeway in making whatever alterations I like in that regard, or bare minimum at least allow for far more than it does now. There are plenty of semi-realistic atmospheric games like The Division that manage to not only balance having character customization, but actively integrate it as a crucial component of the experience. And since Fireteam Elite is pretty obviously taking influence from games like The Division specifically, as we'll get to shortly, it puzzles me why they didn't bother taking notes on how relatively well that series has handled immersion through customization. That said, since we're still on the subject of immersion, I think this is an excellent opportunity to transition to discussing what the developers have seemingly been most eager to show off as a reason for buying the game. That being the design of the maps featured in the game's 4 current campaigns. I say current because it currently remains unclear whether the developers intend to release additional campaigns as either free or paid DLC. But given the way the game is structured and the way the campaign level selection screen is organized, it seems a likely possibility that there is more down the road, or at least there is planned to be more down the road. Regardless, currently 4 campaigns with each containing 4 levels is what we have to play. There's 2 critical components at the core behind the design of any great level or map, and those are how it looks, aka its visual aesthetic and appeal, and how it plays in regards to the actual gameplay. Having both components remain consistently strongly in sync with one another throughout the entire game is oftentimes what distinguishes a great game from merely a good one. After spending time with Fireteam Elite, I'm happy to report that as far as the former goes, and all things having to do with the visual aesthetic and atmosphere, the developers did a wonderful job in carefully replicating and expanding upon the kinds of locations one would expect to see in an Alien experience, whether it be a film or a game or whatever. You have your typical enormous and very clunky ship, prone to making unexpected loud noises that tend to act as fake jump scares, lots of vents for the Xenos to hide in, outdated retro 70s style sci-fi computer tech, etc. You also have the Xenomorph's own layers, which tend to have a sleeker but yet archaic look that strikes a fine line between feeling old and yet futuristic at the same time. In terms of matching the kinds of locations and concept art from the films and other Alien lore, the developers have done a very fine job indeed of recreating that tone within a video game context. In some areas, I would say they even exceeded Alien Isolation in this department. And I'll be honest, I didn't think any game in the near future would ever exceed Alien Isolation in any regard in terms of being loyal to the Alien IP. Where they dropped the ball, however, was in the actual design of the levels themselves and almost all matters related to the gameplay itself. While the initial gameplay and cinematic footage debuting ahead of the game's official release indicated it was going to pursue a more bombastic Left 4 Dead-like experience, where it's pretty much go 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 from beginning to end, this couldn't be further from the truth. Instead, players are forced to run from small set piece to small set piece that, while it may appear pleasant to look at, is far from pleasant to play in. Because all the levels appear to follow the same stop-go mentality, where you proceed a little way in through mostly empty corridors, where you're generally unlikely to run into more than an insignificant handful of individual enemies, before eventually you're told you and your team need to hold your ground at a specific location. You can usually tell which locations these are, as they almost always seem to include ammo resupply crates along with health packs and other useful supplies. In doing so, Fireteam Elite appears to follow the age-old gaming tradition of signaling to the player it's time to get their shit together by granting them easy access to a bunch of useful items just before all hell breaks loose. It's obvious and predictable, but that in of itself I don't really mind. What I do mind is there is ultimately nothing in the way of anything bearing even a passing resemblance to actual exploration or survival gameplay, which is quite to the game's detriment as this is an Alien-inspired game. While I'm willing to concede to the idea of a heavily armed squad sent in to deal with the Xenomorphs, rather than a small team of mostly unarmed and incredibly unprepared people, as was the case in the original Alien film, I find it deeply upsetting that for a franchise that is regarded with such fondness for its horror elements, mainly that surrounding the Xenomorphs, but also by extension the unsettling desolation of space, far more than any of the other more superficial sci-fi traits. The developers made the confounding choice to take the fear, the looming dread, the oozing suspense out of the game, in favor of mind-numbing, click on the heads and instantly die Gears of War style gameplay. What is the point of visually replicating the tone and atmosphere of the films and associated lore if all along you knew the gameplay was going to fly in the face of it all? One component of the game's design that I do feel is not only solid compared to the dreadful areas I've outlined earlier, but indeed, in my opinion, is beyond reproach, is the sound effects. You can say many things about the game. You can say it doesn't look like an Alien game, it may not play out like you'd want it to, but you can't say it doesn't sound like an Alien game or film would be expected to sound, because it absolutely does. I can't think of any weapon sound effect, xenomorph sound effect, or environmental sound effect that would ever sound out of place in an Alien film. Whoever oversaw the audio work here, you did all you could to immerse the players in this world, and while others might overlook such a detail, I tip my hat to you. The last thing one would find desirable in a Ridley Scott-inspired Alien game would be to have the xenomorphs look and sound nothing like xenomorphs. One area I have more mixed feelings on is the game's performance. Fireteam Elite is overall surprisingly well optimized compared to what I was expecting. I've been running this game off a NVIDIA 2070 RTX graphics card with an Intel i7 CPU and 16GB of RAM, and several of the levels played out very smoothly. However, there were one or two levels where the optimization just immediately fell off a cliff for unexplained reasons. The most notable being the jungle level, where you dive into this underground xenomorph base. In that level, I experienced a lot of stutter and frame drops at the very onset of new xenomorph waves spawning in. I can only assume that the game just automatically spawns in all those enemies at the exact same moment, despite their actual models appearing on screen more gradually, because I can't think of any other reason why this would happen. Most of the other levels performed fairly fine. In fact, most of them performed great. I would only notice the very occasional dip in frame rate, like the game dropping from 60 FPS to maybe 45 FPS before instantly going right back up. Whenever I record, I turn VSync on because, let's be honest, unless you're playing a super high-intensity, fast-paced FPS game like Doom Eternal, there's not generally much of a reason to obsess over whether 200 frames a second is really all that more impactful than 100, especially since most console players have been playing games on 30 FPS for untold generations and have gotten by just fine. But that's why I'm not really a PC elitist. My only concern is whether the frame rate is high enough and consistent enough where it has no demonstrable effect on my gameplay. And from that perspective, yeah, Fireteam does still need a bit of work in that department. Fireteam Elite makes use of a cover system, although one does have to wonder fundamentally what purpose it serves in almost all situations. The xenomorphs, save for a single spitter-like projectile AoE class, are almost entirely exclusively close-range melee units. The only other enemies I can recall that ever deal ranged fire are the enemy robots you have to fight in a couple of levels, but they don't consistently appear in all the levels. And the inability to quickly and efficiently move from cover to cover without breaking out of cover altogether, as you normally be able to do in any other cover shooter like Gears of War or The Division 2, makes the mechanic a very frustrating and pointless one to use. Moving on, I'm happy to say that not only do weapons in the game sound and look like everything you'd expect in a Ridley Scott-made Alien IP universe, they're all fairly fun to use as a player as well, and there's a decent enough amount of variety to allow you to approach the missions however you wish. You have semi-automatics, automatics, explosive weapons, flamethrowers, and other AoE weapons. You have sidearms, you have grenades, and in short, you have more or less anything and everything you would need in order to repel waves of agitated xenomorphs. And all of these weapons can be leveled up to unlock additional attachments, cosmetics, and other equipment. The main overall incentive for players to succeed in playing through and replaying the game's various missions is the in-game unlock system. In the aforementioned little mini open-world hub that you hang out in between missions, you can find various vendors willing to sell you consumables, attachments, new weapons, etc. Most of these are fairly decent. The guns, for the most part, weren't exactly super memorable, though. There were a few obvious go-to options, like the flamethrower as well as a grenade launcher, both of which were rather fun to use. But there were many others that more or less felt like the same exact weapon, but with slightly differing stats. For the assault class, there were two weapons in specific that, in both visual and mechanical design, were almost identical, save for the singular distance that one was automatic and the other was semi-automatic. There are also some cosmetic sprays and decals that you can plaster on your weapon, but most of them are only fully visible on specific weapon types, and are prone to cutting off arbitrarily on most others. One of my favorite things to purchase with my available credits are the turret guns. There is a surprising degree of variety with the turret guns. I initially assumed, like most other tactical games, you'd have a single standard mini turret gun, with maybe you being able to unlock later an upgrade allowing you to equip more than one, once you've proceeded far enough in the campaign, but no, you can put down quite a few at once. I put down at least 3 turrets to guard one single area before, and combined they can deal quite a bit of ranged damage. I would assume that this ability is universal among all players, but since none of my friends have Xbox Game Pass, and I'm not one of those super rich YouTubers yet that can afford to buy 3 or 4 copies of every co-op game I review, I haven't tested this theory. That said, I do find it quite amusing to entertain the distinct possibility that, when you multiply this to take into account the 2 other players, you could potentially place up to 9 concurrent turret guns at once to defend a single point of interest. One could almost be forgiven for wondering whether it'd even be necessary for the players to shoot at anything or just let their combined sentry gun fire resolve the immediate danger on their behalf. And if you get bored with the normal sentry gun, good thing you have a few variants to pick from as well, including a flamethrower turret as well as a EMP turret. While I haven't really used either of these for more than maybe once or twice in total, I don't think it'd be hard to imagine the flamethrower turret being especially useful against xenomorphs, while the EMP one would be of far more significance against the robot enemy types, the Working Joes I believe they're called. The game isn't necessarily generous with the amount of credits you receive for each mission completion, but you do get more than enough to buy what would be considered the bare necessities for each mission, such as turrets and other consumables. But if you want to build up far more currency, you have to play into the game's challenge system. By successfully completing missions, you gradually unlock these challenge cards which you can use on further replays. I had one which you might say was a moderately difficult one where you had to get a total of 150 headshots over the course of that match. Had I played the match the way it was intended, where you had to get to this escape ship, activate it, and jump on board, I still would have been at least 50 headshots short of my goal. Between 3 players, there simply weren't enough Xenos to make that a realistic goal to reach. Instead, I decided to annoy the hell out of the voiceover pilot who kept screaming in my ear about how we had to go at that moment, while I casually held my ground for the next 10 or 15 minutes as the same exact waves of enemies appeared from the same exact visible spawn points at the same exact times, so I could get closer to my goal. The saddest bit is that I got as high up as I think 142 or 143 headshots when I realized my AI companions were all bleeding out on the ground around me or already dead, and I had 2 Xeno Chargers running at me, so I had to quickly turn around and book it back to my ship before they closed the distance. Even with my sprinting followed by a forward roll onto the ship, I still barely made it. While some might hear this and assume the game is hard, I do want to make an important distinction in clarifying that this is not a challenging game per se. The only way that Alien Fireteam can prove at all challenging is by just wearing you down with wave after wave after wave after wave of xenomorphs and these robot guys, all chipping away at your health bit by bit and that of your teammates, until it becomes a life or death situation for you. Simply throwing more and more and more enemies at the player as the player gradually depletes his supplies isn't really what it means to provide a meaningful challenge, but more times than not, that's the best Alien Fireteam Elite can hope to pull off. Overall, do I recommend buying Alien Fireteam Elite? Not really, not unless you see the game being offered at an insanely discounted rate on Steam or whatever. But for those of you that have Xbox Game Pass, however, where I myself was able to play it from my PC, absolutely. You're essentially already paying for it by being a paid subscriber, so why not? It's not necessarily a terrible game, but it is one of those games that you and maybe your friends will get together and play for a few hours one time and then never replay again in your life. It's one of those budget games that 10 years ago you might expect to see a couple dozen copies of in a bargain bin over at Walmart or GameStop. It's not great, it's not terrible, but it's passable at best. On that totally uplifting note, that's where I think I'm going to wrap it up for today. You know the drill, liking the video is always appreciated, and for those of you new to the channel, I do post new reviews roughly once a week here, sometimes once every other week, in addition to other gaming content. If you want to support the work I do, subscribing and clicking the bell to opt into getting notifications does help. I'm always happy to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section too. I respond to basically anything and everything posted down there, so if you're looking to get my attention, you know where to find me. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.